Greetings from Ljubljana. My name is Tina Kobilček, and as head of delegation of Slovenia to the UNFCCC, I am pleased to be presenting an overview on the progress of Slovenia towards achieving our quantified economy-wide emission reduction target for 2020. First, let me briefly present our country. Slovenia, an EU member state since 2004, is a country that features a diverse landscape, predominantly forested. Climate change is at the core of the agenda of the country. This year, for the first time, the government has established a new ministry which has united key sectors that contribute to the majority of the emissions created in Slovenia. The Ministry of the Environment, Climate and Energy spearheads climate policy and legislation. Moreover, Slovenian Environment Agency is responsible for emission inventories and reporting. Due to climate change impacts, there has been a notable warming trend with an average temperature rise of 1.7 degrees Celsius from 1986 to 2011. This August, Slovenia was hit by worst ever floods, catastrophic devastation across much of the country. Slovenia's economy, 90% of the EU average in GDP per capita, is led by the industry and trade sectors. Regarding energy consumption and production, there has been a notable 12% rise in gross inland energy consumption since 2005. The energy mix includes liquid fuels, nuclear energy, renewable sources, and solid fossil fuels. The post-financial crisis resulted in a growth in road freight and car traffic. Public passenger transport growth halted due to pandemic measures. Its geographically strategic location is influencing freight transport, especially due to the port of Koper. The agriculture contributes 0.8% of GDP, with crop production being dominant activity. Organic farming is on the rise, covering around 11% of the agriculture area. Forestry, an important economic sector, contributes 0.7% to GDP. Slovenia derives 24% of its GDP from the industry sector. Manufacturing plays a significant role, with energy-intensive industry contributing notably to the economy. Slovenia, as part of the EU, actively shapes and complies with common EU climate policies. Slovenia's climate policies reflect a comprehensive approach that integrates EU regulations, directives, national legislation, and sector-specific strategies. The emphasis is on transitioning to a low-carbon economy, promoting sustainability and addressing the challenges posed by climate change through both mitigation and adaptation measures. Slovenia aims for climate neutrality by 2050, aligning with the Paris Agreement. The National Long-Term Strategy, Resolution on Slovenia's Long-Term Climate Strategy until 2050, sets an 80 to 90% GHG emission reductions from 2005 levels by 2050. Slovenia sets a national target to reduce GHG emissions by at least 20% by 2030 in non-EU ETS sectors, surpassing EU requirements by 5 percentage points. Sector-specific 2030 targets are also established, including significant reductions in widespread use sectors, waste and energy transformations. Additionally, we are updating our national goals to the EU's increasing ambitions with Fit for 55 and Repower EU packages, seeking a 55% reduction in GHG emissions by 2030. The legal frameworks for the updated national energy and climate plans are currently being drafted. The EU emission trading system, EU ETS, is crucial for incentivizing emissions reductions, covering 38% of Slovenia's GHG emissions. We are also aiming for a coal exit by 2033 and reducing the use of coal for electricity generation by 30% by 2030, while managing a just transition in coal-dependent regions. Slovenia is currently in the process of adopting its first national climate law. The latter will further strengthen the achievement of our national climate goals, contribute to the fulfillment of international climate obligations, and cover the increased EU ambition into the national policy framework. A complex mix of economic, political, and global health factors have shaped Slovenia's emissions over the past 3 decades. Slovenia has significantly reduced its GHG emissions since 1986. In 2020, CO2 emissions made up the majority of Slovenia's greenhouse gas emissions at 81.2%, with a significant decrease of 23.3% compared to 1986, largely tracking energy consumption trends. Methane emissions comprised 11.9% and nitrous oxide emissions 4.9%. Both also decreased since 1986 by 27.2% and 6.8% respectively, while F-gases made up 2% with varied trends, highlighting different reduction successes amongst various gases. The energy sector was the largest contributor to GHG emissions in Slovenia, accounting for 79.1% of the total in 2020, and saw a 23.9% reduction from 1986 levels, despite a temporary increase in emissions during 1999 and 2007 due to higher electrical energy consumption. The transport sector experienced a significant rise in emissions by 200% until 2008, followed by fluctuations and a decrease due to the COVID-19 lockdowns in 2020, demonstrating how external factors like pandemics and economic shifts can impact emission trends. Agriculture was the second largest source of GHG emissions, mainly contributing methane and nitrous oxide, while emissions decreasing over time due to better farm management and intensified dairy cow breeding. However, the LULUCF sector showed reduced CO2 removals due to policy changes and natural disturbances, and the waste sector's methane emissions declined by 34.5% since 1986, with improvements in waste management and recovery practices, showing sector-specific challenges and progress in GHG management. Current projections for greenhouse gas emissions in Slovenia are similar to the previous biannual report from 2019, which was based on the Life Climate Pact PAT 2050 project using 2017 as the base year. New projections are underway. The report includes projections with measures, projections with additional measures, and without measures. Overall, the 2025 projections for total emissions of GHG with measures shows an increase in emissions to 7,011 kilotons CO2 equivalent, which is 7.3% higher than 2020 levels, but 0.4% lower than 2019, suggesting slight progress when considering pre-pandemic emissions levels. By 2030, emissions are projected to slightly decrease by 0.5% to 16,931 kilotons CO2 equivalent, and by 2040, a further reduction of 5.1% compared to 2030 is anticipated. The projection with additional measures offers a more optimistic outlook, with 2025 emissions nearly equivalent to 2020 levels, but by 2030 emissions could reduce significantly by 17%, and by 2040 an ambitious 47% decrease from 2030 levels could be achieved. Without any measures, the projection indicates a stark contrast with a continual increase in emissions, reaching 23,544 kilotons CO2 equivalent by 2040, which underscores the importance of sustained policy and action to curb emissions. Carbon sinks are expected to decrease after 2030 with measures, but remain relatively stable with additional measures throughout the period up to 2040. What is also important to be noted is that the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in an over 7% reduction in emissions in 2020, setting an atypical baseline for comparison for future projections. If we break down projected emissions by sectors, we can note that in the energy industries and fugitive emissions, with measures, a slight increase is projected by 2030, followed by a decrease by 2040. With additional measures, reductions are much more significant. 30%, 34% by 2030 and 71% by 2040. Concerning industry, with measures, emissions decrease by 2030, then rise again by 2040. With additional measures, a steady decline is projected, reaching a 46% reduction by 2040. The transport sector, with measures, there is an increase by 2030 expected, but with additional measures, there is an initial rise followed by a sharp decrease after 2030, reaching a 59% reduction by 2040. In agriculture, emissions are projected to rise by 6% by 2040 with measures, while additional measures limit the increase to 9% reduction by 2040. Waste and other sectors, there is significant reductions are anticipated in both scenarios, with additional measures achieving over 50% reduction by 2040. The land use change and forestry, the LULUCF sector in Slovenia overall acts as a net emissions sink, reaching minus 3,280 kilotons CO2 equivalent. The sector's ability to absorb CO2 fluctuates, turning from a source to a sink between 2014 and 2019 due to natural disasters and salvage operations. With current measures, CO2 sinks from forest management are expected to reach minus 4,780 kilotons CO2 equivalent by 2030. Additional measures may lead to lower sink levels in 2030, but are projected to maintain higher sink levels in 2040 and 2050. In summary, Slovenia has set national targets in line with the overarching goals of the Paris Agreement. This approach is similar to other EU countries that have set net zero targets, reflecting a growing European consensus on long-term climate goals. While there are challenges, particularly in sectors like transport and industry, Slovenia's efforts reflect a broader trend towards ambitious climate action, taking a proactive stance. The international assessment and review process facilitates a constructive dialogue between countries. Questions and feedbacks from other nations provide valuable insights into the effectiveness and challenges of national strategies, facilitating a collaborative approach to climate action. It also fosters transparency, accountability, and collaborative learning among developed countries in their climate action efforts, thus contributing to global efforts to address climate change. Thank you very much.